Hello and welcome to Thursdays for the Soul. I'm Cheryl Lindsay, Minister for Worship and Theology for the United Church of Christ, and your host for today. Thursdays for the Soul is a webinar series for the whole church. We faithfully focus on care and education for the people of God and create opportunities to digitally worship together as the whole of the United Church of Christ. From prayer, music, and psalms to interviews of key leaders and how-tos in congregational life. This series stays current to the relevant topics of the time and offers opportunities of connection in the wider church and in your community. Together, we can bring our church and the world towards the world God imagines for all of us. This year, we will be with you once a week on Thursdays with new conversations and topics as inspired by your questions and comments. As always, we're grateful for your presence, your gifts, and your questions. Thank you for being with us today and all along the way. Friends, if these conversations move you, if what's offered here helps enhance your ministry or your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your prayerful and financial support helps programs like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you and thank you. Before we get to today's session, let me tell you about what's coming up. On Thursday, February 24th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Confronting Bias in Search and Call. Join members of the MESA team and staff and members of First Congregational UCC in Washington, D.C., as they share wisdom and experiences in moving towards anti-racist and other anti-bias practices in Search and Call. On Thursday, March 3rd, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, UCC Rural Voices of Worship and Praise. Rural identified congregations of the United Church of Christ provide a vital role for the spiritual and physical well-being of their communities, often with innovative ways of limited resources. Join us for an hour of inspiring worship and praise by rural identified congregational leaders and pastors as they celebrate UCC ministries in rural areas. As usual, you can visit ucc.org or any of our social media platforms to find out about upcoming sessions like this. And that brings us to today, where we will engage in a conversation about becoming abolitionist. And we are joined today by Derecka Purnell, Esquire. Let me share a little bit about her background. Derecka is a lawyer, organizer, and the author of Becoming Abolitionist: Police, Protest, and the Pursuit of Freedom. In the wake of the corona pandemic, Pernell co-created COVID-19 Policing Project at the Community Resource Hub for Safety Accountability to track police arrest, harassment, citations, and other enforcement through public health orders related to the pandemic. She received her JD from Harvard Law School, her BA from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and studied public policy and economics at the University of California, Berkeley, as a public policy and international affairs law fellow. Her writing has been published widely, including in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Boston Review, Teen Vogue, and Harper's Bazaar. Pernell has lectured, studied, and strategized around social movements across the United States, the Netherlands, Belgium, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and Australia. She is currently a columnist at The Guardian and a scholar in residence at Columbia Law School. Welcome, Derecka Purnell. It is so good to have you with us. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much for having me. I have been looking to this conversation literally for months, and so I can't explain or express what it means to be here finally. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive right in. We know the issue of policing continues to be the ebbing and flowing in terms of public consciousness as we see incidents of police violence escalating, reaching critical mass of media attention, but then it also ebbs and flows when media attention is diverted elsewhere. In your book, you talk specifically about abolishing the police as a solution to police violence and these incidents. But I think it would be helpful because there's so many different proposals that are out there and they tend to be conflated and people think that they all mean the same thing. Can you just share with us a basic understanding of what abolition means in terms of policing?
Yeah, such an important question. And it's a question that, I mean, obviously I get a lot. It's like, what is this abolition thing? And it may be sometimes easier for me to start with what it's not. So abolition is not mere police absence, right? It's not snapping our fingers and then all the police disappear overnight, right? There's 18,000 law enforcement agencies, nearly 1 million cops. There's almost 3,000 jails and prisons. No abolitionist organizer, lawyer, writer who's serious and committed to the policies of abolition believes that any of this can happen overnight. What abolition is, at least the tradition that I belong to, we believe in reducing the reasons why people think they need police, reducing the police, right? Reducing our commitments to policing. And we're trying to do this at the same time, over time, until we're making the institution obsolete, right? And as we're doing that, right, as we're eradicating community-based violence, we're eradicating capitalist-based violence, we're eradicating violence in our home, and we're building just relationships between each other, between our neighborhoods, between our communities, and between the planet. So that's what it is. It's commitment to eradicating all forms of violence because we know that we cannot drive out violence with more violence. So it's a commitment to eradicating that violence and building up the actual systems to ensure that people can thrive.
Wonderful. I think you dispelled a lot of myths just in that first answer.
Hopefully, yes.
So one of the things that I really appreciate in reading your book and actually listening to it, the audible version of it, was you talked about that arriving at this place was a journey for you. I mean, your extensive background in the realm of advocating for individuals as well as policies. I think from your particular lens, it's interesting to see that you actually had to evolve to this conclusion that abolition is a solution. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Of course. Yeah. So what made me so angry in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing in 2012 by police officer Derek Chauvin is that I would hear mayors and other leaders say, you know, Black people don't want abolition or defund the police is a white thing. And, you know, these people, they're not serious, they're reckless, they don't care about survivors. They're going to go back home to their nice neighborhoods and their nice schools and their clean and safe communities and have a well-functioning police department while they're going to leave you in the neighborhoods and the projects and the ghettos and leave you to be unsafe. And it made me so frustrated, the casting of people who are fighting for freedom and justice as unrealistic and not serious, and just collapsing all of our tireless work in making sure that this can happen. And so what I tried to do in the book is say, well, I grew up in a Black and poor working class neighborhood in South St. Louis, right? We called the police for everything. It was the only well-resourced option that we had to respond to our social needs, right? That's what happened. And so if people were fighting because there wasn't enough bill money, you would call the police. If people were fighting because they were threatened or they were a victim of some kinds of harm, they would call the police. My sister, you know, Vicky, she used to have profusive nosebleeds in the summertime. You know, we didn't have good air quality. We lived in one of these zones where the pollution was through the roof. We lived between factories. So our health was constantly under assault. And so what do? There are no clinics in our neighborhood, no hospitals in our neighborhood. No one had, you know, insurance, all of this. And so we would call 911 when my sister just had nosebleeds. So paramedics would come, the fire department would come, cops would come for preventable encounters, right? And then what happens when they come, when they show up? Sometimes they, you know, look around, they threaten you. If you don't have documentation, if you're an immigrant, if your house doesn't look clean, if you make someone upset, well, now in addition to the 911 call, now we're calling child services. So you have people who are risking custody of their children because they feel like they're in a situation that need help. And so, like literally everyone on this call, like everyone in the church, like everyone on this planet, we come out with unexamined ideas about policing that then become formed, right? Through watching Law and Order, if you're guilty like my mom. Like if you watch Law and Order, you're being conditioned to what police are doing. If you live in a neighborhood where police interact with you, politely or kindly, or they're protecting your property, well, you're being conditioned to what police are doing. And so what I had to learn is that all of the social conditioning that I received about police as a kid, it obscured their origins, right? When I was in school, we had books and badges program. The cops would come to my 5th grade classroom, show us their badges, show us their guns. And I was like, oh, okay. My mom had friends who were cops, and so they would come into our house. I also knew that we were afraid of cops. I knew that every time we went to foster care, there were police who were removing us from our homes. I know that when we had domestic violence incidents, I was kicked out of my house. So I had all these other interactions. I knew when we drove from the city to the county in St. Louis, we had to go extra, extra, extra slow. Right? Because we didn't want to get pulled over. And if we did, we had to be quiet and play the game if we wanted to live. So I had all of these mixed relationships to police. And it really took, unfortunately, when Michael Brown was killed by a Ferguson police officer, Darren Wilson, in 2014, I was on my way to law school to be an education lawyer. I had this huge dream. I was going to be Secretary of Education. I wanted to be a superintendent. I just knew that education and law was for me. And here we have this police killing, okay? Mm-hmm. And I started hearing people more and more say, police, they come from slave patrols. And I was like, oh, that sounds a bit outlandish. And then you go and look at the history. And you say, oh, wow, police do come from slave patrols. They do come from colonization of Ireland from the British, right? They do come from this history of suppressing labor strikes, right? And so all of this rebuilding trust with police that people were pushing in 2014, I could never find a point in history in which there had been trust in the first place. So how are we rebuilding trust and care and support when that history has never existed? And so I spent the next several years just trying to understand the origin, the purpose, and the function of police. And I was shocked by what I found, shocked that the critiques that I heard in my family and in my neighborhood were legit. Right, they were legit, and they were connected to a much broader critique of police, and that people who were far more curious than I was, and far more interested than I was, and far more radical than I was, who decided to take it upon themselves to learn what police actually do, and say, well, they don't keep us safe. They ultimately manage inequality, and I'm still on the journey. We're all still journeying. I'm still learning things every day around what police do and how they enforce different behaviors. And it's on us, people who care about freedom and justice, to tell the truth about it. Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking me that question.
Absolutely, and thank you for responding so vividly. And one of the things that I was struck by, and I've done some reading elsewhere about this historical lens, and understanding that the system isn't actually functioning in the way it was designed. You talked a little bit about the origins with the slave patrols. Can you talk a little bit more about the history and the evolution of policing, particularly in America?
Yes, of course. So where to even start? We can go all the way back. Let's go to the 1500s. We have Spain, who's trying to take over the land that will become Cuba. And we're trying to colonize it, killing indigenous people, stealing land, bringing enslaved Africans over to do the work. And it's one way to say, police came from slave patrols, but that's not the full story. Mm-hmm. What actually happened is that during Europeans' first contact with indigenous Africans, there was a point of resistance. Right. It wasn't as if people were lining up to get on a boat. Right. This was not a cruise ship. That's not what was happening. At that point of encounter, you have people who are running away, who are resisting, who are fighting back. And so if you're trying to capture people who are running away, what do? Right. You put them in cuffs, you chain them. Right. You use weapons to force them to get on ships to go across the Atlantic. When people are at the belly of that ship, And they're trying to think, how do we get free? We don't know where we're going. How do we stop this? And they're planning rebellions on slave ships. They're planning rebellions on on the way over. Well, it's going to be important for the crew, right? The European crew on that ship to figure out who's planning what. So then what do? You create a system of informants, right? You create a system saying, how do we figure out who's planning what, who the ringleader is, okay? When people are running away in Cuba and Barbados and Trinidad, if you want to stop people from running away and fleeing to the indigenous communities over there, you set up a system of patrols, right? Where people are constantly walking around in bands looking to capture or to prevent people from running away. All of these systems, informants, cuffs, cages, raids, if you think that enslaved people are planning to stock weapons so they can have a slave rebellion or plantation, the origin of the raids that police do comes from them raiding slave quarters looking for people who resistance. And so it's only one part of the story to say that police come from slave patrols, but police and police power, police practices, they developed in response to indigenous people's resistance. Right? Because then you wouldn't need that. You wouldn't need overseers, right? You wouldn't need officers. You wouldn't need South Carolina to pass laws to make every able-bodied white man to set up a statewide region of patrol, right? You wouldn't need to do that if people were willing to subject themselves to the brutal realities of slavery. And so in each of these iterations, police are gaining more and more power. You have South Carolinians who are learning from, their counterparts in the Caribbean on how to institute a patrol system, because resistance in the Caribbean was amazing. There were constant people running away, maroon communities that were developing. And so South Carolina is now trying to prevent its enslaved population from learning from the Caribbeans and the maroons there. Right. And they say, okay, teach us. So much of the early forms of policing are actually modeled after the policing in the Caribbean, because that's where the resistance was happening. This is true after Haiti. You see this in Louisiana and Alabama and Texas, right? And so these systems form in response to our resistance, right? These systems form in response to our resistance. And then if we read W.E. Du Bois, he says, well, there's this other thing that's happening too. Look at who becomes an overseer. Look at who becomes a member of the patrol. These are poor white people, right? These are poor white people who, but for their whiteness, would have been better off forming solidarity with the indigenous people who were being slaughtered and with the Black people who were being enslaved. But the role of an overseer or a police officer, it gave them some means, a little bit more means, right? A little bit more money, a little bit more status than the people who they were brutalizing. So it became a labor source for all of the white people who couldn't be slave owners, who weren't property owners, who didn't have any status, but at least I can now have control over a population that's subordinate to me. And what's so sad when I think about the effort to diverse police departments, we're drawing still from people who are mostly poor, who are still locked out of all sorts of economies, landless peoples who don't have a lot of options out of high school. And it becomes essentially what Reverend Barber calls a poverty draft. Like we see that in the military, we see that also for policing. And we look at poor Black people and say, look, these are your options. You can get caught up, you can get killed or go to jail if you want to live a life that's like harsh and rough. Or you can enter into the Black middle class by becoming a police officer. It's a noble position. You keep your community safe. So we're duping so many people who at least sometimes even earnestly try to become a cop to be something different. But ultimately, that system is unjust. If we don't get to the root causes of that system, we're going to think we can just diversify our way out of it. We cannot.
Yeah, and you talk about the injustice of the system and all of the intersections with healthcare and with, food deserts, medical deserts, all of those things, how they come together. Can you talk a little bit about how those types of inequities, social, economic, can lead to an exasperation of the problems that exist with policing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell a story. I can't remember if this is in the book because I haven't read the book in a few months. I like, you know how
You don't read it every week?
not every week. I'm guilty. No, I don't read it every week. I actually have to read it because the paperback, very excitingly, is coming out in the fall. So I have to do a whole. I have to thank you. I have to revisit the whole thing now, but can't remember if I tell this story, but I told it last night, and I think it speaks to your question.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to live in Southeast DC, in one of the most class exploited neighborhoods in the whole city, right? I live in an area called Anacostia, and even within Anacostia, I mean, it's just completely divested neighborhood, Black working class neighborhood. Now I moved there right after law school, okay? One day I was driving home and I was listening to this NPR show, and they were talking about the number of trees that were in my neighborhood, like in my community, versus the number of trees in Northwest DC and the more white, more affluent parts of town. And they said because of the number of trees, there's so fewer trees in Southeast DC that in the summertime, we can see a 10-degree difference between these neighborhoods. Okay, so this is a difference between 70 and 80 degrees, or 80 and 90 degrees, and 90 and 100 degrees. If you know how weather works, you know that heat can trigger asthma attacks, it hurts breathing. If you have high blood pressure, it can impact, you're outside, you're breathing, your health. If you're trying to keep your home cool, your bills are going to be higher. So in poor neighborhoods, when my grandma used to say, don't run in and out my house, it's a real thing because our neighborhoods are literally hotter. We know people are agitated more quickly. There's more overcrowding in poor neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods. And so I'm listening to this story and my mind is just blown because I'm thinking, well, there are people who are experiencing summer very, very differently, right? Because of neglect, because of blight, because we believe that the shadier trees are only supposed to be in neighborhoods where there's affluence, right? And I'm thinking, well, in my neighborhood, we have shot spotters, we have cops, on every other block. There's constant patrolling that's happening. Maybe the solution to some of the harm in our neighborhood is not just keep investing more cops, more cops, more cops. Maybe we need to plant more trees, right? Maybe we need to beautify our neighborhoods. There's this whole theory called broken windows policing. And the notion is that in a community where there's a broken window, you leave it broken, crime is going to start festering. People don't take it, don't take the neighborhood seriously. You need more police to respond to maintain the order. It would be so much cheaper if we just fix the windows. Isn't it much cheaper to fix a window than to hire a cop, right? And so there are serious investments that we can make in our neighborhoods that can impact so much more, like trees. Trees literally produce oxygen. If you plant trees around a home, it reduces the energy costs. It reduces the bills. So you don't have working class people paying more for bills, even though they need more energy, right? There's such a rearrangement of social relationships that we can have to our environment and to each other that can solve and alleviate our health concerns, our environmental concerns, our concerns about harm and violence, if we are courageous enough and if we take time to pay attention to them, rather than just defaulting to more police, more prisons, more prosecutors, more cages, because that's not going to keep our neighborhoods cooler. More police are not going to keep our bills lower. They're not going to stop the fights over bill money. They're not going to stop parents from being angry at their children for running out of, right? They can't address social problems. So we have to be committed to figuring out what's actually happening in this community and what's the most constructive way we can be responsive to it.
And that illustrates how important those creative solutions to real problems can lead to this eradication of the need for policing. But I want to also pick up on something you mentioned earlier about having the police be the only accessible resource that people could call in crisis situations. We've seen where incidents of violence have occurred and police killings have occurred when someone called because someone was having a mental health crisis, for example. Can you talk a little bit about those sort of public service or social service options that are not necessarily as readily available as the police, because the police you call 911 and they'll come, but they come with the tools that they have.
Right.
And so if you call someone with a gun and that's their tool, that's the tool that they reach for. What other services can we call, and what tools are needed in exchange for that tool?
I love this question just so much, because this is sometimes what happens. I'll be in conversation with someone and they'll say, Derecka, I'm almost with you. I'm almost there, girl. I'm almost there. Listen to me, I'm almost there. But I'm not ready to let go. I don't understand why we have to abolish the police or defund the police if we know that we just need more services, right? We should just do both. Maybe we should get all the services that we need first in place, and then we can abolish the police, okay? Or defund the police. And intuitively, I 100% agree with that, right? It's like, oh yeah, we shouldn't, put the cart before the horse. We need to build up all these other solutions and options before we can take away the one that we have. Unfortunately, what history has shown us is that when communities do attempt to build their own responses to community-based harm, the police either co-opt it or they intervene and destroy it, right? It happens. We look at the Black Panther Party, we always talk about the free breakfast program. We don't talk about the police raids that destroyed the free breakfast programs in Oakland and in Chicago. They destroyed community health clinics, right? If we look at the street violence interruption work that the Black Panthers tried to do, that the Black Liberation Army has tried to do, that so many community-based groups have tried to do, we see the police literally agitating gangs in order to create work for them to go do, okay? There's this incredible story, I think it took place in the late 70s in Boston when the crime started to decrease. And so a gang of police and fire department officials went around the city to set fires and created a narrative. This is a New York Times article. I'll drop it in the chat. They went around the city to create fires, to create a crime panic so that they could continue to get more funding to do police work, okay? If we look at the policies that we have in place, like the Violence Against Women Act, when we see the funding that's supposed to go to community-based organizations to help women or to stop gender-based violence, to help children, so much of that funding is contingent upon whether the community-based organization will work with police, right? Even though the police are a major source of community-based violence, right? The police of all professions that we have some of the highest domestic violence rates, okay? It's tragic. But if you want to get funding for your nonprofit to be an alternative, you may not get that funding if you don't agree to work with police. So part of what we have to do is examine where all the relationships where the police are coupled with the alternatives, and how do we, disassociate those relationships? How do we break up those relationships? When I think about even police athletic leagues, do you have these things where we say, yes, let's get the police to do a basketball camp with the youth. Why do we need people with guns to do basketball camps with the youth? Why can't we just hire actual coaches to do basketball camps with the youth, all right? And so what happens is then we're only going to be willing to fund alternatives as long as they're connected to police. So we have to take a step back if we want to push some of these creative solutions and alternatives. In the meantime, we have to say, well, we want them decoupled from police. We need to have them separated, because we need to make sure that once people no longer feel comfortable going to a shelter or a nonprofit that's working with the police, that we're then not going to get backlash. I was reading a story just a couple of days ago about this sheriff or a deputy in California who used someone's, this is hard to say, but used someone's rape kit. Right? Did you see the story?
I saw this. I was reading that last night. Yes.
to match them to a crime. So when people think, well, I'm going to, go to police to get help because I've been so, I've been so brutalized. I'm looking for, please, take my DNA. It's being used against them. So we have to figure out how to do that, examine where are all these relationships. And so when we invest in these creative alternatives, they're just not destroyed or taken over or co-opted, by law enforcement. And it happens all the time. Like it literally happens all the time. And so in the book, I talk about this amazing article by Rachel Herzing, and it's bold steps we can take towards a police-free future. And she gives us a little diagram, a little map about how we can build different relationships to make sure that we're prepared in the case of an emergency. And she goes over time, right? They go over time. If something happens to you right now, who are the people that you can call, right? And 3 months from now, what are a set of meetings you can go to so you can be part of a democratic process to decide if police are going to get funded and how much they're going to get funded, and how can you make sure community organizations are getting funded. And so I highly recommend Rachel Herzing's work around taking steps towards a police-free future. Critical Resistance has something called the Oakland Power Project, where they help people come up with alternatives to call 911, which is, again, so important. It's a start, right? It's a start. We need much more than this. We need more creativity, more energy. But I think that if we listen to people like Rachel Herzing, like BYP 100, like Critical Resistance, they give us a roadmap of how we can start.
Great. And we can include these resources in the follow-up email that we'll send to those who registered, so they can get them. So you don't have to worry about dropping it in the chat. We'll make sure that they get them that way, as well as put them in the description when it uploads to our YouTube channel as well. As you were talking, I was also thinking about policing in our educational system, police presence in school. Can you talk a little bit about how that functions to perpetuate a policing culture and the school to prison pipeline?
Yes, I would highly recommend that everyone reads Elizabeth Hinton's work. I know I'm just giving so many resources.
Give us all the resources.
Yes, I'll get all the resources. I mean, in studying people like Elizabeth Hinton, I was just surprised to learn that as all of the rebellions that were happening around police violence in the 1960s, they really made governments say, well, let's make sure that we're policing all of these Black kids because we don't want them to rebel too. And then when schools started integrating more, we see the rise of policing to keep, white kids safe from like the Black kids who are now being integrated into their school. So in one sense, we can think about this as a school to prison pipeline program, because we know that kids who are in working class communities, kids that are in Black communities, they experience criminalization, suspensions, expulsions at rates that far exceed their white counterparts. I mean, for the same behaviors, But in many other schools, the schools also function, unfortunately, like prisons, right? We have a system of rewards and privileges. People are moving at the sound of bells. And so when we think about abolition, we're also trying to figure out, how do we make sure that we're reducing our reliance on prisons to solve social problems, right? As Angela Davis teaches us. And we're also making sure our schools are places where people can learn, and we have to be committed to that. So in chapter 1 of the book, I talk about what it was like for me to go to a school where every day I had to walk through a metal detector, had to pull my pants legs up, I had to unzip my binder. None of this is with my consent. Who are you keeping me safe from? And most of the violence that I witnessed at the school was from the school cops towards the students they were supposed to be protecting. I also highly encourage people to look at the work that Power U is doing and that Advancement Project is doing, my former employer, around getting getting cops out of schools. There have been now it's more than a decade's campaign to get cops off of campuses because of the rampant assaults that happens, at our Black and brown schools across the country. And it's sad because I know that, I mean, I'm a parent, I have 2 kids. I know what it feels like to grow, to be a child of like the Columbine generation, and where school shootings are terrifying. And the idea that I send my kids to school every day and I pray to God that they're safe, that they come home, right? I pray to God that my children don't enact violence against anyone. I pray for both. Right. And so I can understand the parental impulse that we need cops in our schools to keep our kids safe. And I urge other parents to think, well, what makes our kids safe? If we want people to not come to school with guns, then we need to fight against gun production in our country, right? That is the root cause of the problem. Like, that's what we have to fight against. But we can't put more people with guns in our schools because they're not even good at preventing the school shootings. It's wild. So now we have a regular militarized presence, many police states in some of our schools, but it's not getting to the root causes of the problem.
And how much of the resistance to gun control, gun legislation is rooted in the Second Amendment, and how much of the Second Amendment rooted in policing and the establishment of militias.
Yes, yes.
All the connections and the systemic connections that are there.
Yes, I mean, you just stated it perfectly. It's exactly that. Some of the earliest, and I found this out when I was researching the book, but some of the earliest gun control laws on this land were to stop enslaved people from having weapons, right? Like, that was gun control. That was good. When I say that these laws, these criminalizations is in response to our resistance, that's what I mean. And so when we go back, even before the Second Amendment, you have people, again, in South Carolina was the biggest port of entry for enslaved Africans into this country. So much of it starts there. But what happens is that you have landowners in Europe who are funding the settler colonizing of this land that became the United States, who is saying, listen, we need to fight indigenous people like at all costs. It's arm the slaves and make them fight with you. And you had slave owners, like people here or land was like, no, we don't want to arm slaves, because what's going to happen? They're going to turn against us, or they're going to have the indigenous people fight. And they were right. They were right. And so what happened? You started seeing people ban guns for people who are enslaved. You see major gun control legislation when the Black Panthers go to the state capitol who carrying arms. And so the increasing legislation and criminalization around gun control is for Black people, even though, we know how school shootings happen, right? We know how the most spectacular ones happen. So you're right, it's all rooted, it's all connected.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to the chat, and there's a comment in the chat that I'm wondering if you can speak to, and I'm going to summarize. And if I, to the person in the chat who asked the question, if I'm not summarizing it accurately, please go ahead and provide that correction. But we often hear in terms of some of the overall the naming of these movements, that often that the names that are chosen can be weaponized and used to evoke different meaning than is originally intended. And so an example is critical race theory could be called instead inclusive history, or in this case with abolish the police or even defund the police, instead could be named something like increase social resources, so that it's spun from a more positive light and in ways that theoretically couldn't be manipulated by those who try to dilute the message or to change the message in some way. What are your thoughts about that?
I love this question. I get this question often. And the first thing I'll say is that it seems usually when I get this question is that a lot of people assume that if we change the language of the demand, then people would be on board. And that has not been the case at any point in history. At any point in history. I think about the early Christians who didn't say Christ and had to draw the sign with the fish, because what would happen if they said Christ, right? But when we talk about Jesus today, we don't continue just to use the fish, right? We say Jesus, we say Christ, we say his name. Like we're called to do that as people of faith. And so sometimes I'm nervous that our movements to do the right thing, they get caught up as if they're PR and not fights for freedom and justice. So today, when we talk about slavery abolitionists, we talk about them with such regard. You know, we talk about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman with such regard. We have to understand that these people were hated, right? They're on your posters at your church. People hated them, tried to kill them repeatedly, right? People could not stand that, right? They couldn't do that, right? And so what happened is that now that we have time, what have people done? Like we have said that, oh, these people are on the right side of history. Same with the civil rights movement. Civil rights at the time was, people hated the idea of civil rights. And it wasn't because of the word civil. It wasn't because of the word rights. They hated the idea of equality, right? Equality, another word that people couldn't stand. And it's not because they didn't understand the definition. It's not because they didn't like how it sounded. They didn't believe that Blacks were equal to white people. So whatever language we would have used, the resistance to it was rooted in a white supremacist like antagonism towards it, okay? And we have to be honest about that. I think that, so like that's something, same with women's suffrage. It wasn't that they didn't like the word suffrage. Men did not want women to vote because if women could vote, they would have democratic access and power over decisions that, you know, that govern their life. And so it's not about the word. People don't want the power. And same with critical race theory today. Critical race theory was birthed out of a legal movement formed by someone who taught at Harvard Law School, Derek Bell. The issue around critical race theory is that the people who are fighting to ban it, they actually don't care about critical race theory, okay? Because what they're banning is not even critical race theory. Martin Luther King is not critical race theory. Right. They're using critical race theory to ban anything regarding race and racial justice education. So I don't have a good faith assumption that Ron DeSantis in Florida wants to ban it because of the words critical race theory, okay? He is interested in stopping children of all colors from learning about racial justice. And if we don't say that, if we aren't honest about that, then what's gonna happen is that we're gonna keep doing a language game when they don't care. So for example, when Bernie Sanders says, you know, we should have free healthcare. I like free. Do you like free? Free sounds great. But people are up in arms about free education, up in arms about free healthcare. Because again, the issue is not just the words. The issue is what we are trying to do, which is transform this society, okay? So that's like one sense, okay? Mm-hmm. The second part of that, which is very important to me, which is why I do the work that I do. This is why I write. This is why I wrote a book. This is why I'm a columnist, which is why I organize, which is why I am in conversations. There are lots of people who hear defund the police and abolish the police, and they don't know what to think. They're like, oh man, like what is this? Am I gonna be safe? Right? Am I gonna be afraid? Right. I think it's on us, on people, again, who care about freedom and justice, to not then cower or to say, I'm not going to use the words that's going to change this country because you don't understand it. It's very important to me, actually, to move closer to you, right? To be in more conversation with you, to go to your neighborhoods, for you to come to my neighborhoods, for me to talk about this in my church. It always surprises me how, at least as a person of faith, how we're supposed to be evangelistic and spreading the good news, and we're afraid to say the words for the good news. It's like, yeah, words absolutely matter. And because they matter, it's important for us to be honest about them. And so inclusive education doesn't do the same thing as critical race theory. They do two different things, right? Mm-hmm. So when I go to neighborhoods, when I go to community, I talk to even my mom. When I first told her about abolition, she said, absolutely not. What are you talking about? Right? It took my mom 3 years to have a serious conversation with me about what it means to abolish the police. And so I think sometimes what happens is that we assume that since a word or an idea enters the mainstream and it's hot for a moment, and we can't win people over, then we have to abandon the cause or abandon the terminology. Building relationships takes years for us to do this work. That's why we belong to a movement. If we just keep changing, there's not going to be no consistency with what we're trying to do. And so that we keep showing up, that we keep asking questions, that we keep organizing, that we keep using activism, that we keep using speak truth to justice, that's how we build those relationships, right? That's how we explain what we mean. That's why I'm talking to the 200 people who came today, right? It's exactly that. But if we always are going to be willing to change our words just to make some people feel more comfortable, now I don't know if that is what at least I'm called to do as a person of faith, right? I don't know if that's what I'm personally called to do. I think I'm called to organize, to be in deep community conversation, to get feedback, to keep trying to go, but it's hard and we just have to figure out how to do it. But I don't think that we should continue to pivot over PR and slogans because it's so much deeper than that, like so much deeper than that.
And so a question or a statement that just came up that I think might be a good place for where you just landed is, okay, the person indicates they're in a very small, all-white church in a rural community, which represents a plurality, if not the majority, of the United Church of Christ. And they want to know or wondering about how can I make those conversations happen in their faith community? What recommendations would you have in terms of beginning to have this conversation to bring awareness and to speak truthfully using the words, but how to make it realized in practical terms and in specific communities?
Yes, I love that question so much. One of the reasons why is because it's what we do with other things that we kind of care about or we're passionate about. And so I believe in starting very small, right? Are there people who come to my Bible study or people who come, to church every day? One other person who will be willing to have this conversation with me, and then let's talk about it. Let's say every Tuesday we're going to meet and talk and read something together. I get to suggest something, you get to suggest something, but we're going to be committed to reading about this thing once a week. Just going to have a conversation about it once a week. Okay. Then after we do that, a couple weeks, let's say there's a third person or a fourth person. And what we do, we decide to meet once a month, just once a month. We read together, we talk about it. We see, are there other churches who are also having a similar conversation? It's First UCC in DC having this Conversation, or the Abolition Apostles that's happening, having a conversation about how, maybe we'll, build like a community where we're checking in with another small white church that's, in another part of the country or another part of the world. We're all going to meet, once every 6 months. I think starting small and building relationships like that and realizing that it's not your job to be right and bring someone with you, but actually to be in community together and spend time doing that. You're not trying to win someone over right now, but you're trying to build a relationship. That has to happen smaller over time. So I think I was surprised a couple of years ago hearing, I was listening to this young white woman minister. She was saying how scared she was to ask her church to put up a Black Lives Matter sign. And I took that for granted. I remember driving, I was like, why are there so many Black Lives Matter signs in all these white neighborhoods? But I didn't know that people were scared to ask. And so what she did, she said, I asked a couple of people, I tried to build a small group of support, and they said no the first time. Then we, talked a little bit more, we talked a little more, we did it again, we asked again, agitation, practice, relationship building. So I think starting small, and that's outside the church, it's in your place of work, that's in your family. I'm still having conversations with people in my family about, abolition, about policing, because it's not like people change overnight. So how do we build that trust, that love in order to do that? Oh.
Wonderful. This conversation is so good, it has to be joined from the air. So I want to ask another question in the chat that I think really a lot of people, it gets to the heart of what a question that a lot of people have in terms of crime. So actual, murder, assault, those things, people wonder, I still want to be physically safe, and police seems to be the solution or the option available to prevent it, deter it, or to investigate it. How would you respond to those concerns?
The first thing I would say is read chapter 5 and 6 of the book, where I talk about murder and sexual violence. And the reason why I specifically wrote about murder and sexual violence, because there's never enough time to talk about all of what it takes, right? So the first thing I'll say is that, again, police are not going to disappear overnight. That's not what's going to happen. What abolition requires is a commitment to reducing community-based violence, carceral-based violence, capitalist-based violence, climate-based violence. And so abolition isn't just trying to say no police and every other, harm continues in society. That's not what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. What abolitionists are asking instead is, why do people kill people? Why do people kill people? Because the police don't ask that. About 14,000 people are killed every year in this country, at least. Right, that's not including the 3 people a day that police kill, but 14,000 homicides in this country. Why? Right? Why do people kill each other? And the answers really range, but there are 3 big buckets. One of them is toxic masculinity, right? A man says something that offends another man, they have a small trivial argument and it escalates to a homicide. It's number one reason why people kill people, right? The number 2 reason is when a man is trying to control the sexuality of a woman, right? They don't want her to leave a relationship. They don't want her to have sex with somebody. They don't want someone else to desire her. They believe that they should control her. Number 2 reason, okay? Number 3 reason, people believe that they have to use violence to control property, okay? So when we think about George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin 10 years ago this month, yes, absolutely. George Zimmerman was a white and Hispanic, self-appointed neighborhood watchman in Florida who stalked and hunted a Black teenage boy. But what did he say? He said, these punks, these whatever, always get away. And he was concerned about his private property and took it upon himself to use violence to enforce it. Okay. So we have to look at why these killings happen and ask, can police stop toxic masculinity? Can they stop the control over women that leads to death? Can they stop the private property arrangements that we have that lead to violence? Okay, so murders do not happen in a vacuum. There are root causes to all of them. Even sexual violence, we say something like, oh, that person is just crazy, or they're just evil people. Actually not. We know this from psychology and sociology and history that less than 2% of people who commit sexual violence happens while they're in a crazy or psychotic episode. So what about the 98%? We can't right? That means that we can stop the 98%, right? The police can't. After excessive force, sexual misconduct is the second highest complaint against the police. So what abolitionists are asking, what are better ways to stop murders and sexual violence, right? What are better alternatives to respond to them? How do we prevent them? How do we provide direct support to survivors of them? How do we practice actual accountability, right? That deter people from doing it again, or realize like, oh, this is harmful. But when you have people who are in relationships and their life is so afraid, they're so afraid to leave a relationship because they might get killed, or they leave a relationship because they don't have a roof over their head, or they don't know what to do about childcare. Police can't stop that. Police aren't babysitters, right? Police aren't employers. They're not going to hire that person to make sure they get income. And so again, we are funding a well-established body of body searchers, right? They go and find the body. I don't want to keep paying people to go find the body. I want people to live. And that's what abolition is about. How do we preserve life? How do we do that? But if we continue to give trillions of dollars of money to the police, we're not going to get to the life-saving causes of what we actually could be doing. We're not going to spend money investing in eliminating, reducing toxic masculinity, right? Or stopping the control over women, making sure that people can live the kind of lives that they deserve. We're not going to think about our relationships to property different, because we're going to keep trying to do a one-size-fits-all. I mean, you said it earlier, there's if you got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if you got a gun, everything looks like a target, right? And that's what we keep paying for target practice. I'm tired of that. You know, I'm not going to be here to see the ultimate abolition in that society. My children are not going to be here to see the ultimate abolition of police and a transformation of that society. But what I think that we can have right now is the courage to say, this generation, the people who are alive right now, we made a commitment to getting there. Because I don't want it to be on me while people are behind. Right? If we don't do what we're supposed to do right now, the people in the future are going to be behind. And I don't want that on me. So I'm doing everything in my power that it takes to make sure that that society happens one day.
Who I could talk to you all day.
Yeah.
The whole word right there. I just encourage all who are listening, whether it's live right now or who will hear this later on one of our social media channels, to get the book, to read it, to digest it, and to share it. And speaking of sharing it, we have an offer to make to the first 50 registrants. That means if you are live on the webinar platform right now, and you reach out to Jennifer White, who has been in the chat directly with your name and address, and let her know, we will send you a copy of this incredible resource, this incredible book. You will not regret delving deeper into it. Thank you so much. Do you have anything else that you just would like to share with us that we haven't touched on before we conclude our time today?
Oh, wow. I hope, and I sincerely mean this, I am so grateful for this conversation. Like I said, as a person of faith, as someone who identifies as a Christian, who is very excited that I just found a new church home, it matters the most to me that Christians and people of faith understand this the most, the absolute most. Right. When I think about the power of revolutionary love and what we're called to do, it's a mandate, right? It's a mandate that we take this seriously. And so I hope that, you know, if people decide to read my book, obviously I'll be happy. But there are so many more people who write about this, who think about this, who organize around this, and have been doing this for decades, for 30, 40, 50 years, right? I know it just became hot in 2020. I know it just entered into the mainstream a couple of years ago, but I really hope people know we're part of a much larger tradition, right? And any movement for freedom and justice has always been up against people who have more power than us, people have more status than us, people have the better language than we do, right? Like we've always been up against that. But the best of our tradition means that we continue to tell the truth. And I hope that people take time. It doesn't mean you need to leave this call, identify as an abolitionist. It doesn't mean you need to do any of that. All it means is to keep having the conversation, keep being curious, keep being open-minded, because that's what I'm trying to do as well.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, Minister Lindsay, for having me. I really appreciate it.
And we will continue to follow you and to keep you in prayer. And why don't we pray as we conclude our time together? Gracious, eternal God, we thank you for being a God who liberates, a God who frees, a God who restores and makes all things well. We're reminded of your promise to give us life and life abundantly. And so, God, we come before you with the cause of helping your creation, your children, our siblings to live, God, just to live the lives you have called them to live free from any bonds, but a connection to you. So we ask you to bless this work, to open minds and hearts to greater understanding and just curiosity and wonder about what it could be, what your creation could be, a life of and a world made of harmony and real lasting peace that is more than the absence of conflict, but is what you created and how you would have us to live in community with one another, flourishing and living life to the full. We thank you for this time of sharing, and we ask that the seeds planted today would be nourished and bear much fruit in the days and months and even generations to come. In the name of Jesus the Christ, we pray. Amen. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, my sister.
Siblings in Christ, if you were moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry, or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.